The night was unusually still, not silent in a comforting way, but in a way that felt deep, endless, as if the world itself had slowed its breath. A narrow path stretched between dark mountains, winding gently through mist that never seemed to lift. The air was cold, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine. Along that path, a single figure walked, a young monk. His steps were slow, deliberate, each foot pressing softly into the wet ground, making only the faintest sound. Step, step. The noise faded almost instantly into the night, as though the darkness swallowed it whole. He did not speak. He did not look back. It felt as if something had drawn him here, something quiet, unseen, something he could not fully explain. Far ahead, barely visible through the drifting fog, a shape began to form. At first it was nothing more than a shadow against the mountain, but with each step it grew clearer. Stone walls, tall and weathered, an ancient monastery. It stood alone, as if it had been forgotten by time itself. The surface of the stone looked worn, softened by centuries of wind and rain. And rising above it all, a tall bell tower, cutting into the dark sky like a silent watcher. The young monk slowed his steps. Something about the place felt different, not dangerous, not welcoming either, just still, too still. A faint scent reached him, old wood, cold stone, and something else, a trace of smoke, as though candles had been burning for a very long time. He stopped in front of the entrance. The door stood slightly open, just enough for a thin line of warm light to escape into the night. For a moment, he simply stood there, breathing in. Slowly, then gently, he placed his hand against the wood and pushed. The door creaked open, a long, low sound echoing softly into the darkness behind him. Inside, warm air brushed against his face. The space was vast. A great hall stretched out before him, supported by tall stone pillars that disappeared into shadow. Candles flickered along the walls, their small flames trembling, casting long, shifting shapes across the stone. The light did not reach far. It only revealed fragments, leaving the rest hidden in darkness. In the distance, figures moved, other monks. Their robes flowed quietly as they walked, their footsteps barely making a sound. No one spoke. The silence here felt intentional. The young monk stepped forward, and at that moment, a strange feeling settled over him, as though he had crossed into a place where time moved differently, slower, heavier. He could hear something, very faint. At first, he thought it was the wind, or perhaps the soft crackling of candle flames. But no, it was something else. A voice, or many voices, distant, blurred, like a prayer being whispered from far away. The words were impossible to understand. They seemed to drift in and out of existence, never fully forming. He continued walking, until suddenly someone stood before him, an older monk. He had approached so quietly, it was as if he had appeared from the shadows themselves. His eyes were calm, deep, and unsettlingly still. "You are new." His voice was soft, but carried a quiet weight. The young monk nodded slightly. Yes. The older monk studied him for a moment, not just looking, but observing, as if he could see something beneath the surface. Then, without another word, he turned. "Come." They walked together down a narrow corridor. Doors lined both sides, all closed. The candlelight stretched along the walls, thin and wavering, creating long shadows that followed them silently. At last, they stopped. The older monk opened a small wooden door. "You will stay here." The room was simple, a wooden bed, a small table, and a single candle, its flames steady but faint. The young monk stepped inside. Behind him, The older monk remained at the doorway. For a moment, he said nothing, only stood there, as if listening. Then, slowly, at night, he paused. The silence between his words felt heavy. Not everything you hear is real. The young monk frowned slightly. What do you mean? But the question faded, because the older monk had already begun to close the door. Slowly, gently, click. The sound echoed softly in the small room, and then silence. The candle flame flickered once, twice. The young monk sat down on the edge of the bed. His breathing slowed. The air felt different here. Still, heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding on to something. Time passed, or perhaps it did not. It was hard to tell. Then, from somewhere far above, a sound. Soft, distant. Not the wind, not footsteps. Something deeper, a single tone, low and slow. Dong. The young monk's eyes opened. He remained completely still, listening. Again, dong. His breath caught that sound. It was not coming from the hall, nor from the corridor. It was higher, far above him, from the tower, the bell tower. The sound lingered, not loud, not sharp, but deep, as if it had traveled through stone, through air, through time itself. Before reaching him, the young monk did not move. He sat perfectly still on the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on the trembling candle flame. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined it. The older monk's words returned quietly. Not everything you hear is real. The thought settled in his mind, slow and heavy. Perhaps it was only the wind, moving through the high tower, shifting something unseen, perhaps. But then, dong. The sound came again, clearer this time, closer. The flame of the candle flickered sharply, as if it had felt the vibration too. The young monk inhaled slowly, holding the breath for just a moment, then releasing it just as slowly. He stood up, carefully, quietly. His bare feet touched the cold stone floor. For a brief second, he hesitated. There was no fear in him, not yet. Only curiosity, a quiet pull, the kind that does not ask, but simply draws you forward. He moved toward the door. His hand rested against the wood, still, listening, nothing. The monastery had returned to silence. No voices, no footsteps. Even the distant whispering prayers from before had faded into nothing. Slowly, he opened the door. The corridor beyond stretched long and empty. Candles still burned along the walls, their light soft and unchanging, as though untouched by time. He stepped out. The air felt colder now. Or perhaps he was only noticing it more. He began to walk, each step measured, gentle. The sound of his movement barely existed. The corridor seemed longer than before, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. As he passed each closed door, he felt something strange, a presence, not seen, not heard, but felt, as though behind every door something waited, not moving, not breathing, just waiting. He reached the end of the corridor. There, a narrow staircase spiraled upward, stone steps, worn with age, leading into darkness. He stopped at the bottom. The air above felt different, thicker, colder, as though the tower itself held something the rest of the monastery did not. For a long moment, he stood there, listening, nothing, and yet something remained. Faint echo, not a sound, but the memory of one. The bell. His hand brushed lightly against the stone wall as he began to climb. Step by step, slowly, the staircase curved tightly, the world below disappearing with each turn. The candlelight from the corridor faded, replaced by pale moonlight slipping through narrow slits in the tower walls. The higher he went, the quieter it became, until even his own breathing felt too loud. He reached a small landing. A wooden door stood before him, old, weathered, slightly open. A thin stream of silver light spilled through the gap, mixing with the mist that had somehow found its way inside. He stepped closer. The air was cold now, cold enough that he could feel it in his chest. Slowly, he pushed the door. It opened without resistance. Beyond it, the bell tower. Open space, dark beams stretching overhead, and in the center, the bell, large, ancient, its surface worn and uneven, marked by time. It hung completely still. No rope, no movement, nothing. A young monk stepped forward, his eyes fixed on it, waiting, listening. Silence, deep, endless silence. Then, a faint movement, so small it was almost impossible to see. The bell shifted, just slightly, as if something unseen had brushed against it. The young monk's breath slowed. His body remained calm, but his mind began to understand. There was no wind here, no force strong enough to move it, and yet it moved. He stood there, watching, waiting, and then, dong. The sound did not echo outward. It felt as if it echoed inward, through him, through the walls, through the silence itself. Far below, something shifted, not in the tower, not in the air, but somewhere deeper in the monastery, unseen, unnoticed, except by whatever had just awakened. Morning came slowly, not with brightness, but with a pale, quiet light that slipped gently through the narrow windows of the monastery. The fog still lingered outside, pressing softly against the stone walls, as if it had no intention of leaving. Inside, everything felt unchanged, calm, still, silent, as though the night had never happened at all. The young monk opened his eyes. For a moment, he simply lay there, watching the faint glow of daylight touch the ceiling above him. The memory of the bell returned, not as a sharp thought, but as a feeling, deep, heavy. He sat up slowly. The candle beside him had long since burned down, leaving only a thin trail of hardened wax. Nothing in the room suggested anything unusual. No movement, no sound, and yet something felt different. He stood and made his way out into the corridor. The monastery had begun its morning routine. Monks moved quietly through the halls, their robes brushing softly against the stone floors. Some carried small candles, others walked with their heads lowered, lost in silent thought. No one spoke, not a single word. The young monk followed the others toward the main hall. There, rows of monks had already gathered. They stood in still formation, facing the front of the hall where dim light flickered from a cluster of candles. He took his place among them. The air felt thick, not with tension, but with something quieter, something unspoken. A low chant began, soft voices, rising and falling together, like a slow tide moving through the room. The young monk listened. The sound was calming, steady, and yet something about it felt incomplete, as if a single note, a single voice, was missing. His eyes shifted slightly, glancing along the line of monks beside him. One space, empty. It was subtle, easy to overlook, but once noticed, impossible to ignore. After the chanting ended, the monks began to leave in silence. No discussion, no acknowledgement, just movement, orderly, calm, as though nothing was wrong. The young monk hesitated. Then he stepped closer to one of the older monks standing near the edge of the hall. "Excuse me," he said softly. The monk turned his head slightly. His expression remained neutral. There was someone here yesterday. The young monk paused, choosing his words carefully. He is not here now. For a brief moment, the older monk said nothing. Then, he has left. The answer came too quickly, too simply. The young monk frowned slightly. Left. When? No response. The monk had already turned away, continuing on as if the conversation had never happened. The young monk stood there, a quiet unease settling into his chest. He left the hall, moving back through the corridors, his steps slower now, more aware. He passed door after door until something made him stop. One of them was slightly open, just enough to notice. He stared at it for a moment, then gently pushed it wider. Inside, a room, simple, just like his. A bed, a table, a candle. But something was wrong. The bed, untouched, perfectly arranged, as though no one had slept in it. The candle, melted down, cold, and on the table, nothing. No belongings, no sign of life. It was as if the person who had lived there had never existed at all. The young monk stepped back slowly, his eyes scanning the room once more, searching for something, anything, but there was nothing, only stillness, only absence. He closed the door gently. The soft sound echoed faintly in the corridor, and for the first time, a question formed clearly in his mind, not rushed, not panicked, but steady. If the monk had simply left, then why did it feel as though he had been taken? The young monk exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting upward, toward the unseen height of the monastery, toward the tower. The bell had rung, and now someone was gone. Behind him, far down the corridor, a faint draft of cold air moved through the hall, subtle, barely noticeable, but enough to make the candle flames tremble. The monastery grew quieter as night returned, not suddenly, but slowly, like a breath being held. The young monk lay awake, not restless, not afraid, just aware. The events of the morning lingered in him, the empty space in the hall, the untouched room, the silence that followed. It did not feel like something had been lost. It felt like something had been completed. He turned his gaze toward the small window. The sky beyond was dim, covered in drifting clouds. The moonlight came and went, faint, uncertain. And then, dong. The sound returned, soft, distant, but unmistakable. The young monk closed his eyes briefly, not to block it out, but to feel it more clearly. It was deeper tonight, heavier, as though it carried meaning now. He stood. There was no hesitation, no questioning, only movement. He stepped into the corridor. The candles burned lower than before, their flames smaller, weaker, as if the night itself had dimmed them. The air felt colder. He walked forward. The monastery seemed longer now, the shadows stretching further along the walls. The doors, still closed, still silent, but different. The presence behind them was gone, completely. He reached the end of the corridor. The staircase waited, spiraling upward into darkness. He paused only for a moment, not from fear, but from recognition. This was the path, the same path the others had taken, the same path that led upward, toward the bell. He placed his hand against the cold stone and began to climb, step by step. The sound of his movement echoed softly now, not loud, but no longer swallowed by silence. As he ascended, the air shifted. It grew thinner, colder. The faint scent of old metal reached him. The higher he went, the more the world below seemed to fade, until only the staircase remained, and the quiet rhythm of his breath. He reached the landing. The wooden door stood before him, closed, but not fully. A narrow gap allowed a thin line of pale light to escape. Moonlight. He stepped closer. The wood was rough beneath his fingers, worn, aged by time. Slowly, he pushed it open. The hinges made no sound. Inside, the tower welcomed him once more. The mist had returned, drifting slowly through the open space. The bell hung above, silent, still, unmoving. But something had changed. He stepped forward, his eyes moving upward, toward the rope, or where it should have been. There was no rope, only a frayed end, cut long ago. The fibers were worn, old, untouched. No hand had pulled this bell in years, and yet it had rung. He stood there, looking up, the realization settling into him slowly, not as shock, not as fear, but as certainty. The bell did not need a hand. It did not need force. It did not need anything. That belonged to the world below. The mist shifted, softly, as if something had moved through it. The young monk did not turn. He did not search. He only listened, and in that silence, something began to form, not a sound, not yet, but the beginning of one, a presence, subtle, patient, waiting. Above him, the bell remained still, but the space around it felt alive, as though it remembered something, as though it recognized him. The young monk closed his eyes, and for the first time, he did not feel like an outsider. He felt expected. The night returned, slowly, quietly, as it always did. The monastery dimmed once more into shadow, its long corridors lit only by scattered candles that flickered like distant stars. The young monk did not sleep. He lay still on his bed, eyes open, watching the ceiling, waiting. Time moved differently now. Each second stretched, soft, endless. He did not know how long he had been awake, only that the silence had deepened, and then it came again. Dong. The sound drifted down from above, low, hollow, familiar. The young monk closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, but in understanding. It was real. There was no doubt now. The bell was ringing, and no one was touching it. He sat up slowly, his movements calm, controlled, as though he had already made his decision long before this moment. He stood and stepped into the corridor. This time, the silence felt heavier, not empty, but full, as if something unseen had filled the space, watching, waiting. The candles flickered more noticeably now, their flames bending, as if reacting to something passing through them. He walked forward, step by step, until once again he reached the staircase. The tower waited. He did not hesitate. Upward. The stone steps felt colder than before, the air thinner. Each breath he took seemed quieter, absorbed by the walls around him. As he climbed, a new sound began to form, not the bell, something else, soft, barely there. At first, it was nothing more than a suggestion, a faint vibration in the air, but with each step, it grew clearer, whispers, not one voice, many, layered, overlapping, endless. The young monk slowed, his hand resting against the wall. He listened. The whispers did not come from one direction. They came from everywhere, from the stone itself, from the air, from the silence between his breaths. He could not understand the words. They were too faint, too distant, and yet they felt familiar, like echoes of something once spoken, long ago. He reached the top of the staircase. The door to the tower stood open, wider than before. The mist had thickened inside, curling gently through the air, wrapping itself around the wooden beams above. He stepped inside. The bell stood before him, still, silent, waiting. The whispers continued, soft, unending. He moved closer, each step slow, measured. The stone beneath his feet felt almost hollow, as if there was space beneath it, something unseen. The air grew colder, colder than it should have been. His breath became faintly visible, dissolving into the mist. He stood beneath the bell now. Looking up, its surface seemed darker than before, the marks etched into it deeper, more to find. As though they had changed, the whispers shifted, not louder, but closer. For a moment, they almost formed words, almost. The young monk tilted his head slightly, listening more carefully. And then he felt it, not a sound, not a movement, a presence, right behind him. He did not turn, he did not move. The air had changed. It pressed against him, cold, heavy. The whispers stopped. All at once, complete silence, the kind that feels unnatural, the kind that does not belong. Then, very softly, a single breath, not his own, right beside his ear. The young monk's eyes remained steady, forward, on the bell, and slowly, without warning, the bell moved, not from the wind, not from force, but as if something unseen had taken hold of it. A small shift, barely visible, but enough. Dong. The sound was deeper this time, heavier. It did not travel outward. It sank downward, into the monastery, below, into the stone, into the silence. And with it, the whispers returned. But now they were different, not distant, not fading, clearer, closer, as if they were no longer around him, but within him. The whispers did not fade with the night. They lingered, not as sound, but as memory. The young monk sat alone in his small room, the faint morning light pressing gently against the narrow window. He had returned from the tower before dawn. He remembered walking, remembered descending the cold stone steps, but the space between those moments felt unclear, blurred, as though part of him had remained behind in the tower with the bell. He rested his hands against his knees, still, calm, but something inside him has shifted. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt filled, not with fear, but with presence, a quiet awareness that had not been there before. A thought returned to him, not his own. They did not disappear. The words formed slowly, as if rising from somewhere deep within him. He opened his eyes. The room was unchanged, the same bed, the same candle, but the meaning of it all felt different now. He stood, and this time he did not go to the hall. Instead, he turned toward part of the monastery he had not yet explored. A narrow passage, half hidden behind a heavy wooden beam. It was darker there, less maintained. The air carried the scent of dust and age. Few candles burned in this section, and those that did gave off only the faintest light. He moved slowly, his fingers brushing against the stone wall as he walked. The texture was rough, uneven, older than the rest of the monastery, as though this place had existed long before the others were built around it. At the end of the passage, a door, thick, closed, unlike the others. This one had markings carved into its surface, faded, worn, almost erased by time. The young monk paused. The air here felt heavier, not cold, but dense, as if it carried the weight of many years, many moments, many voices. Slowly, he pushed the door open. It resisted at first, then gave way with a low, dragging sound. Inside, a small chamber, filled with shelves, old scrolls, bound manuscripts, layers of dust covering nearly everything. This place had been untouched for a very long time. He stepped inside. The floor creaked softly beneath his weight. A single candle flickered near the center of the room, though no one else was there. The flame moved gently, as if stirred by something unseen. He approached one of the shelves. His fingers traced along the edges of the scrolls, until one caught his attention. It was different, bound in darker material, its surface marked with faint symbols similar to those he had seen on the bell. He lifted it carefully. Dust fell away in soft clouds. He opened it. The pages were fragile, the writing faded, but still readable. He leaned closer, reading slowly, silently. The words spoke of the monastery's origin, of the first monks who had come to this place, not seeking peace, but seeking silence, a deeper silence, one beyond sound, beyond thought, beyond the self. They believed that within true silence, something waited, not a being, not a spirit, but a presence, ancient, formless, listening. They built the bell, not to call others, but to mark moments of surrender, each ring, a signal, a letting go. A monk would ascend the tower, stand before the bell, and release everything, identity, memory, self, until nothing remained. And when the bell rang, it meant one had been taken, not by force, but by choice. The young monk's breath slowed, his eyes moving across the final lines. Those who hear the bell are those who are ready. The words lingered, heavy, unavoidable. He closed the manuscript gently, his hands steady, but his mind quietly shifting, so they had not vanished. They had answered. The bell did not choose, it called, and those who heard it, those who understood it, they stepped forward. Freely, willingly, the young monk lowered the book. The chamber felt different now, not abandoned, not forgotten, but waiting, as if it had been holding this truth for someone to find, for him to find. Behind him, the candle flame flickered once, then steadied, and somewhere above, far beyond the stone ceiling, the bell remained silent. For now, the monastery felt quieter that evening, not because there was less sound, but because something had settled, a stillness deeper than before, as though the walls themselves had grown aware. The young monk walked slowly through the corridor, his steps soft, measured. He no longer searched for answers. He carried them now, not fully understood, but present. The words from the manuscript echoed gently within him. Those who hear the bell are those who are ready. Ready. He turned the thought over in his mind, not with fear, but with quiet curiosity. Ready for what? He did not know, and strangely, he no longer felt the need to know. As he passed along the corridor, he noticed something. The doors, all closed, as before. But now, he could sense the space behind them, not emptiness, not absence, but something softer, like the fading warmth of a presence that had once been there, not gone, just no longer needed. He continued walking until he reached the main hall. The candles were already lit, their lights steady, unmoving. The monks stood in silence, as they always did. But tonight, something was different. There were fewer of them, not by much, just one. Again, another space, empty. No one reacted, no one looked, no one spoke. The formation adjusted without effort, as though the absence had already been accepted. The young monk took his place. His eyes moved briefly across the line, then settled forward. The chanting began. Low, even, unbroken. The sound filled the hall, but did not disturb the silence. It moved within it, like a current beneath still water. The young monk closed his eyes, and for the first time he heard something beneath the chant. Not a voice, not a word, a space, a pause between sounds, and within that pause something waited, not calling, not demanding, just present. His breathing slowed, matched the rhythm. Inhale, exhale, The chant faded. The hall returned to stillness. The monks began to leave, one by one, as always. But before the young monk could turn, a voice spoke behind him. "You went to the tower." He did not turn immediately. He recognized the voice, the older monk, the one who had greeted him. Slowly, he faced him. The elder stood in the dim light, his expression unchanged, calm, but his eyes, they held something deeper now, not surprise, not concern, recognition. "Yes," the young monk said softly. The elder studied him for a moment, longer than before, as if confirming something unseen. "And you heard it. It was not a question." The young monk nodded. Silence passed between them, not uncomfortable, not tense, just still. Then the elder spoke again. "Many come here and never hear it at all." His voice was quiet, measured. "They stay for years and leave the same as they arrived." Young monk listened. The elder took a slow breath. "But some," he paused, his gaze lifting slightly, as though he could see beyond the ceiling, beyond the stone. "To them, it speaks." The young monk felt the words settle within him, not as information, but as truth. "Why?" he asked. The elder's eyes returned to him. For a moment, there was no answer. Then, "Because they are already listening." The young monk stood still, the meaning of the words, not fully clear, but deeply felt. The elder stepped closer, his presence calm, grounded. "Do you fear it?" The question was simple. The young monk considered it, truly considered it. He searched within himself for doubt, for hesitation, but found none. "No." The answer came quietly, without effort. The elder nodded once, as if this was expected. Then, almost imperceptibly, his expression softened. "Then you will hear it again." The words were not a warning, not a threat, simply a certainty. The young monk did not respond. He did not need to. He already knew. The elder turned and began to walk away, his steps fading into the corridor, leaving the young monk alone once more. The hall emptied. The candles remained, their light steady, unchanging. The young monk stood there for a long moment. Then slowly, his gaze lifted upward toward the unseen height of the tower. The night had only just begun, and somewhere above, in the quiet space between sound and silence, something waited. Not for everyone, only for the one who listens. Night settled over the monastery once more, not as darkness, but as a quiet return. The candles were lit, the corridors dim, the air still. The young monk remained in his room, sitting upright, hands resting gently on his knees. He was not waiting, not in the usual way. There was no tension in him, no expectation, only awareness, a quiet openness, as though something within him had become still enough to hear what had always been there. Time passed, softly, without measure, and then, dong, the bell rang, deeper than before, clearer. It did not startle him, it did not pull him, it simply reached him. His eyes opened slowly. The sound did not fade. It remained, not in the air, but within him. A second tone followed. Dong. He stood, without hesitation, without thought. The decision had already been made, long before the sound arrived. He stepped into the corridor. The monastery felt different tonight. Not silent, but listening. The candles flickered in a slow, steady rhythm, as though responding to something unseen. The air carried a faint chill, but it did not feel cold. It felt clear. He walked forward, each step smooth, unhurried. As he passed the closed doors, he no longer sensed presence behind them. No waiting, no lingering, only stillness, Complete, he reached the staircase. The same narrow spiral, rising into shadow, but tonight there was no hesitation. He placed his hand against the stone and began to climb. Step, step. The world below faded quickly. The candlelight disappeared, replaced once again by the pale glow of moon. Filtering through the narrow slits in the tower walls, the whispers returned. But they were no longer fragmented, no longer distant. They moved with him, soft, steady, like breath that did not belong to him, yet was perfectly in rhythm with his own. He reached the top. The door stood open, wider than ever before. The mist inside the tower was thicker now, flowing slowly, like a living thing. He stepped through. The bell stood waiting at the center, unmoving, silent. A young monk approached, each step bringing him closer, not just in distance, but in understanding. He stopped beneath it, looking up. The surface of the bell seemed clearer now. The markings no longer faded. They appeared, etched, deep, intentional, as though they had always been this way, and he was only now able to see them. The whispers softened, fading into a single, continuous presence. The air grew still, completely still. No movement, no sound, not even breath. And in that stillness, the young monk felt something shift within him. Not a thought, not a feeling, a release, subtle, gentle, as though something he had carried without knowing had quietly slipped away. The bell moved, not suddenly, not forcefully, just enough. Slow, natural motion, as if it were part of the stillness itself. Dong, the sound resonated, not outward, but inward, through him, through the stone, through everything. His eyes remained open, calm, steady. He did not resist. He did not question. He simply remained. And for a brief moment, there was no separation, no monk, no bell, no tower, only sound, only stillness, only presence. Then silence. The bell came to rest. The mist shifted gently. The whispers were gone, completely. The young monk stood there, unmoving, not because he chose to, but because there was nothing left that needed to move. Below, deep within the monastery, a door creaked open, softly, unnoticed. And somewhere, a space was left empty once again. Morning returned, softly, as it always did. A pale light drifted through the narrow windows, spreading gently across the stone floors, touching the walls, the quiet spaces in between. The monastery stirred, but only slightly. There was no sudden movement, no voices, only the slow, familiar rhythm of presence, of routine, of silence. The monks gathered once more in the main hall. Their robes brushed softly against the floor, their steps measured, unbroken. They formed their lines, as they always did, facing forward, still, calm. The candles burned steadily at the front, their flames unwavering in the quiet air. The chant began, low, even, carrying gently through the hall like a slow current. But today, there was a space, not new, not unexpected, just there. One place, empty, where the young monk had stood the night before. No one looked toward it. No one acknowledged it. The line adjusted, subtly, as if the absence had already been accounted for. The chant continued, unchanged, the rhythm steady, unbroken, as though nothing had been lost, as though nothing had been taken. Because nothing had been. When the chant ended, the monks began to leave, one by one, as always, their footsteps fading softly into the corridors. The hall emptied. The candles remained, their light quiet, unmoving, In the corridor beyond, a door stood slightly open. The same room, simple, unchanged, the bed perfectly arranged, the surface untouched. No sign that anyone had ever rested there. The candle beside it melted down to its base, cold, still, no belongings, no trace, nothing left behind. The room held no memory, no echo, no presence. Only space, as though it had never belonged to anyone at all. Further down the corridor, the older monk walked slowly, his steps steady, his gaze calm. He paused briefly, not at the door, but near it, just long enough to notice what was no longer there. His eyes did not linger. He did not turn. He did not speak. He simply continued walking. The monastery remained as it always had been, unchanged, complete. The absence did not disturb it. It did not create imbalance. It did not leave behind emptiness, because what had gone had not been removed. It had been released. And the monastery held no attachment to what had already become part of its silence. Outside, the fog drifted slowly across the mountains. The bell tower stood tall above the stone walls, unmoving, silent, as though it had never made a sound at all. And yet, somewhere deep within the structure, within the stone, within the quiet spaces that could not be seen, something remained. Not waiting, not calling, simply present. The day passed, gently, without event, without interruption. The monks continued their tasks, walking, lighting candles, moving through the corridors as they always did. But as evening approached, a subtle shift returned, not in sound, not in movement, but in awareness. A quiet recognition, shared by all, though spoken by none. Another night would come, and with it, the possibility of another sound. Night returned, one final time, not darker than before, not colder, just familiar. The monastery settled into its quiet rhythm. Candles were lit along the corridors. Soft light traced the edges of stone walls. Shadows stretched, then rested. Everything was as it had always been, and yet something had changed, not in the monastery, but in the space it held. A stillness, deeper now, as though the silence itself had grown. The monks gathered once more in the great hall, their movements calm, unhurried. They took their places. Again, a space remained, empty, unclaimed, but not incomplete. The line adjusted, as it always did, without thought, without hesitation. The candles burned steadily at the front. The chant began, oh, gentle, flowing through the hall like a quiet stream, and beneath it, something else, not a sound, but the absence of one, a deeper silence, holding everything together. When the chant ended, the monks departed, their footsteps fading into the corridors, until the hall stood empty once more. The candles remained, their light soft, unwavering. The night continued, and high above, the bell tower stood, still, unmoving, silent. No sound came from it, no movement stirred its ancient frame. The bell did not ring, not this night, not yet. Far below, at the edge of the monastery grounds, a figure approached, a young monk, his steps slow, measured. The same narrow path stretched before him, winding through the mist, leading to the ancient stone walls. He paused at the entrance. The door stood slightly open, a thin line of warm light spilling out into the night. For a moment, he stood there, breathing in the scent of damp earth, old wood, faint smoke. Something in him felt drawn forward, not urgently, not forcefully, just gently. He placed his hand against the door and pushed. It opened with a soft, familiar creak. Inside, the great hall stretched before him. Candles flickered along the walls, their light casting slow-moving shadows across the stone. In the distance, monks moved quietly through the space, their presence calm, unchanging. The young monk stepped inside, and as he did, something settled, not around him, within him. A quiet recognition, as though he had arrived somewhere he had always been meant to reach. From above, far beyond the visible ceiling, the tower remained still, the bell unmoving. But deep within the silence, beyond sound, beyond thought, something waited, not for everyone, only for the one who would hear it. The young monk lifted his gaze slightly, not fully understanding why, just feeling, listening. The monastery held its breath, gently, endlessly, and somewhere in the space between what is heard and what is not, the silence remained, unbroken, unchanged, eternal. The bell would ring again, but only when it was heard.